This January, the Supreme Court has heard a couple of court cases that ask whether states can ban trans athletes from playing in women and girls sports. Even though this case is just about 2 states, there are 27 states that do have these bans. So there are going to be widespread implications. Furthermore, even though there are very few trans athletes, about 510,000 athletes in total at the collegiate level, but really only 10 of those are trans. Even though this is a small question, it is the question that's looming so large in the political discourse about trans rights more broadly. So this is going to have ripple effects, and it's going to stay as part of the larger political discourse throughout the next election, I predict. So in order to help us make this make sense, we have invited Dr. Elizabeth Pillsworth. Dr. Pillsworth is the coordinator of the Evolutionary Anthropology program in the Division of Anthropology, and she is going to tell us about her expertise and answer questions about sex and gender.
All right.
So let's start with that. Tell us, what do you research? What do you teach?
So I identify, and we're going to use the word identity a lot in this conversation. So I'll start there. That I identify as an evolutionary anthropologist. Now, anthropology, as you know, is one of the most diverse disciplines. It's a holistic discipline. That means that we are looking at what it means to be human from basically every possible perspective: economics, social norms, evolution, cultural institutions, all of those kinds of things. As an evolutionary anthropologist, we tend to be most focused, we're the branch of anthropology that's really focused on thinking about humans as a species. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I love about anthropology in general is that we deal all the time simultaneously with the vast diversity of humans and human individual variation and cultural variation, but we also focus very, very strongly on the unity of humanity. We are one species. We're all the same. We're all humans. So that area, evolutionary anthropology, in part because it's such a holistic discipline, we take our backgrounds from a whole bunch of different fields. So it entails biological or evolutionary biology and evolutionary game theory and economics and all of the psychologies: developmental psychology, social psychology, clinical psychology a little bit, cognitive psychology and neuropsychology. But also, really importantly, my background is very much grounded in cultural anthropology and ethnography. So understanding the ways that our cultural contexts shape our understanding of the world. So it's that interplay between those two. And my own research is focused broadly on, sort of from 2 different directions, what we would call human reproductive ecology, which is basically the evolutionists' version of thinking about sex, right? So it's how did humans evolve to reproduce, but involved with that is a bunch of stuff that we don't think of as reproduction. So flirting, falling in love, striving for status, and things that don't necessarily have to be related to trying to have children, don't need to be related to being in the kinds of relationships that could have children, right? So people ask me all the time, well, how does this apply to homosexual individuals? And it's because the same mating psychology still applies. But thinking about that context of how human sexuality, how human sex differences arose through the reproductive system of humans. But the other side of my background and my area of focus is in gender studies. So looking at the ways that gender is culturally constructed. And this is really important because sex gets us so far, right? Male and female. So one of the things I tell my students in my classes, I use male and female when I'm talking about sex. And that could be about humans, it could be about dogs, it could be about monkeys, it could be about anything. Man and woman is about humans. Human adult, mostly males and females, maybe not, but those are social categories. Man is a social category, woman is a social category. And so bringing those 2 pieces together, this view of human sex and sexuality and sex differences as part of our evolutionary history, but then also thinking about all the different ways that as humans in human societies, we construct those categories and create social categories out of them.
Let's probe a little more there, because in these court cases, there is this question posed about how sex is defined, particularly in terms of equal protection.
Right.
Is sex just biological at birth, or is sex inclusive of a gender identity? And I think that this gets at some of this interplay between what is universal and what changes over history across communities. So can you probe a little more into that question?
Absolutely. So first of all, I would say that the definition of sex from a biological perspective is actually pretty simple and pretty easy, and one of the few categorical descriptors that we can use. So another thing that I always tell my students is that in biology, there are no categories. There are none. Any categorical divisions humans have defined, right? And sometimes it looks like there are categories. So like cats aren't dogs, right? But if you look at all the species in between, you get to a point where you're like, I don't know where that goes. And that's true of literally every category, whether we're talking about animals versus plants, males versus females, whatever. There's no strict categories. But one of the closest we come to that is sex. And that's because that goes back all the way to the evolution of eukaryotes, multicellular organisms, and we started having sexual reproduction, which is basically two different gametes joining together. Almost all vertebrates are characterized by what we call anisogamy, which means having two different types of gametes, ova and sperm. So basically, sex, from a biological perspective, is a four-piece category: egg producers, sperm producers, both producers, or neither producers. And everybody fits in those. All animals, all sexually reproducing animals. And different species have those organized a little bit differently. So some species have spontaneous sex changes. That does not occur in humans. Some species have their standard reproductive strategy is simultaneous hermaphroditism, which means all individuals produce both eggs and sperm. Humans don't really have that either. It happens sometimes, but it's definitely not a part of our reproductive system. So humans are a species that has two primary sexes, egg producers and sperm producers. We also have individuals who produce both on rare occasions. We also have individuals who produce neither on much fewer, less rare occasions. And in that sense, that's all sex is. But it's not all it is, because the important thing about sex, not just in humans, but in all species, is that very often then what comes along with egg producers and sperm producers is a whole bunch of other sexually dimorphic traits. So sexual dimorphism just means the sexes are different. And we can look at nature and see lots of variation in that. So for example, I don't know if you've ever gone up north to see the elephant seals mate. Everybody should do that. Go up to San Simeon. Elephant seals have extreme sexual dimorphism. Adult males are 2.5 times the size of females. Think about that for a minute with humans. If we had that size sex difference in humans, adult men would on average be about 10 feet tall or something. Right? That's a huge sex difference. On the other hand, if you look at emperor penguins, you can't tell the difference between males and females. They look the same. They're the same size, same shape, all of that. Okay, so where do humans fit in? That's what the big question is. How sexually dimorphic are humans? And humans are definitely sexually dimorphic to some degree. We're not extremely sexually dimorphic. We're actually pretty mildly sexually dimorphic. So men, on average, individuals born with XY chromosomes, are on average a little bit taller than individuals born with XX chromosomes, right? So we'll get back into those sex differences and sexual dimorphism in a minute, but to get back to that original question of then, what is sex? Is it a biological category or a social category? It becomes complicated because it's one of those terms that we use for both. So again, from a biological perspective, it's basically egg producers, sperm producers, etc. But from the moment a human is born and is identified as a boy or a girl or whatever they're identified as, that comes along with a social identity, right? And we do that all the time. One of the things that we do know about humans is that we really do try and categorize people by sex, even when we're trying not to, right? We automatically categorize people male or female because on average over evolutionary history, there's a lot of information that comes with that. You're going to have different kinds of interactions if somebody that's coming towards you is male or female. Is this somebody that I could possibly mate with? Is it somebody that I could possibly compete with? Is it all of those kinds of things?
Right.
And so from a social category perspective, the concepts of man and woman, right, those are culturally specific. How we identify a man in the US may not be the same as I work with the Shuar in Ecuador. It's an indigenous population. Eichmann is what the word is for man. They define that a little bit differently than maybe we do. In many cultures, there are more than two sexes that are recognized. So in India, they recognize the hijra. In Zapotec culture in Mexico, muxe. And in Samoan culture, the fa'afafine. So, I mean, we have lots and lots of examples of cultures that recognize that there are people that we call men and people that we call women who are pretty typical for their sexes, right? So that's where that idea comes from, is the typicality, right?
Yeah.
And then we have people who don't fit into that for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's because, I was born into this female role. They labeled me a girl or whatever, but I don't like to do any of the things that girls like to do, including maybe most females are sexually attracted to males, but not all of them, right? So that's an atypical gendered trait too, right? And so lots of cultures around the world and across time have had lots of different ways of finding places for people that don't fit neatly into one of those boxes. The other thing that I really wanted to get out about sex and what that is from an evolutionary perspective, human sexes, as in egg producers, sperm producers, really haven't changed at all in human evolutionary history. We have had this kind of sexual reproduction for as long as humans have been, longer than humans have been humans. Going to early hominid days is when we first start seeing changes that are characteristic of human reproductive systems. So, some of these are conserved traits that we share with other primates, like having regular menstrual cycles that are unsynchronized. So every woman's sort of on her own cycle. Having singleton births. So humans on average give birth to one baby at a time. Being designed to feed our infants on command. We can tell that based on milk composition, right? We aren't evolved to cash our babies like lions. So these features of sex and these sexually dimorphic traits, like sex differences, humans have a whole bunch of secondary sexual characteristics that are different between adult men and women. I mentioned height. We can also look at overall body shape. So men tend to have a much higher shoulder to waist ratio. Women have a really small waist to hip ratio. We have different face shapes. And can I do my quick thought experiment with the babies in the diapers?
Sure, let's do it.
All right. So a thought experiment that I like to give people when you think about how sexually dimorphic are humans is think about if you had a room full of 100 babies, 100
Okay.
infants. They're just wearing diapers, right? So you can't see their genitals. And they have no other cultural cues of gender. So no pink bows or anything like that, right? Just diapers. If I asked you to sort those babies into male and female, how do you think you'd do?
Poorly.
Yeah, definitely no better than chance.
Yeah.
Because there's really no way to
Right.
tell.
Right.
All right, now we're going to get a little, sketchy here, but now imagine a room full of 100 adults, human adults, wearing nothing but diapers or underpants. So again, no cultural cues of gender. So let's say we have hairnets and everything, so you can't see hair, length, or style or anything else. But the only thing that's covered is their genitals. And I asked you to sort them into male or female.
Yeah, it gets a lot easier.
A lot easier.
Yeah.
And you would be right about probably 97 to 99% of the time. You would not be right 100% of the time.
Yeah.
Because again, the cues don't always match.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
But you would be right most of the time.
Yeah. So I'd like to just because you set up the question so well there, I do, and what I see you pointing to is puberty, right? That, and this becomes one of the key questions in the case. So interestingly, the plaintiffs aren't arguing that every transgender female should be able to play on female sports teams.
Right.
What they're arguing is that their particular what is the name for people you're representing? These particular plaintiffs, they have not undergone puberty. They've had puberty suppressants. They've had hormone therapy. So in fact, these particular trans women should be able to play in female sports. So this does raise this question of puberty and how sex differences change after puberty.
Yeah, so they do change substantially. And here we can actually show my graph, because I'm going to show you one example of human sex differences. And this is a very non-controversial one.
Yep.
So these are height data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. These are a little bit old. They're from the early 2010s. But it's about 5,000 individuals in America. This is everybody combined, right? Standing height. You can see a very normal bell curve, right? That's what we would expect. Now, if you can go to the next one, this is what happens when we split the participants by sex, males and females. What we see is two very distinct distributions. There's two questions. One is, how do we group them into males and females? Well, historically, in sciences like this, they group them just by maybe the interviewer being like, that person's male, that person's female. Maybe we ask the person, are you male or female? Maybe people check genitals. Maybe they look at their chromosomes. There's a bunch of different indicators we use for sex. None of them are perfect because there, again, will be variations. There might be somebody who has XX chromosomes but has genitals that don't look like a typical XX genital. What this shows us is that we can see that, yes, indeed, adult men and women are significantly different on average in terms of height. But here's the part that really matters, and I'm going to climb up here a little bit. It's this whole area of overlap, right? And that's what most sex differences in humans look like. Some of them have a lot more overlap. Some of them have a lot less overlap. So what does that mean? Well, that means that, okay, if I asked you to guess the height of a person, and I told you nothing except they were a man or a woman, you would be well served to take that into account and guess the height of this unknown person. If it's a woman, is about 5'4", and if it's a man, he's about 5'8".
Yep.
Right? You'd be less correct if for both of them you just guessed 5'6".
Right.
However, if what matters is how tall they are, right? You're not going to get a very good selection process. If you're like, okay, I need people who are over 5'7", so I'm only going to take men.
Yep.
Well, there's a bunch of men who are under 5'7". There's a bunch of women who are over 5'7".
Mm-hmm.
So if what you are concerned about is getting people who are at least 5'7", that should be what you measure,
Yep.
not what their sex is,
Yeah.
which is, do they produce eggs or sperm, which has nothing to do.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So
With
let's probe there, right? Because I think what these court cases are trying to do is what they are saying, what they're probing is there a sex-based advantage to males or transgender females in playing in women's sports, an advantage
Right.
over cis women?
Right. So could you put that one with the height back up for a second? Because I'm going to just refer to how this plays out with that. So it's a relevant question, right? But to my mind, it doesn't make any sense to pose that question at that level of generality, right? So if I want to say, do trans women have an advantage in sports over cis women? And we're just going to leave it at those two for now because it's easier. I would have to know, what sport are we talking about? I would have to know, as you said, the details of when they transitioned, how they transitioned, what that entailed. So some people transition without ever undergoing any physiological transitions, right? And we would still consider that transitioning. If I am somebody who is identified as female at birth, but I'm living as a man and identifying as a man, that is a version of transitioning. It won't change any of these things. Of course, it doesn't matter when you transition, it's not going to change your height. So on average, trans women are taller than cis women. But that issue of puberty blockers will make a big difference. So we need to look at the characteristics themselves, right, and look at the distributions. Because here's what I don't know about these particular cases, right? If we're saying, let's say we're using not height, but so it depends very much on the actual sport that we're talking about. Gymnastics is one of my favorite sex separated examples of sports. That's extremely sex separated, right? Men's and women's gymnasts engage in completely different activities, right? Men don't do the same kinds of floor routines that women do. They don't do the uneven bars. Women don't do the rings. And the reasons why men's and women's gymnastics are so different is because, on average, men's and women's bodies are so different. I had a colleague today who encouraged me to look up videos of men trying to perform women's floor routines. And they can't. They don't have the flexibility. They don't have the agility. Right? That would be a case where, by the way, a trans woman would probably be at a disadvantage competing in gymnastics, depending, again, on when she transitioned. Other sports, there might be some differences. So if we're talking about like track, yes, on average, men have a longer stride, so they can be a little bit faster, right? Is that enough of a significant enough difference to mean that men and women, or trans women and cis women, or whichever combinations we want, can't compete together? I would leave that to the sports specialist, but I would say it has to be sport specific. It can't be a general idea that men are stronger. Well, yes, it's true. On average, men have greater upper body strength. Women actually tend to have, if we want to talk about strength, tend to be on average more pain tolerant and have greater lower body stamina. So it depends on which feature you're concerned about. And it depends on how far from the other competitors in that class that individual would be.
Yeah, and this does end up being one of the major lines of inquiry, right? Do we, or just on a very broad level, do we write laws for the majority? Or at what one of the lines of questioning is like, at what percentage do you need the minority to comprise that you write the law to include them? Like if 1% of our population is trans, do we write the law differently? So I think that I hear that in this discussion.
Well, and I think that comes down to what is the purpose of constitutional rights?
Yeah.
Right? It's to protect people, and generally it's to protect people who have not had protection.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And one of the things that, to my mind, is really interesting about this debate is that most of the freedoms that we have as Americans, those things that we consider those hallowed rights,
Mm-hmm.
are the top ones. Freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
So that's about having your own mind, your own
Right.
opinions, right? That's not biological.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing biological about that. Freedom of religion.
Mm-hmm.
That's not biological, and yet we think people should be protected to pursue the religion that they have. Sex is a biological thing. So a lot of the laws that are on the books have been put there to protect cis women.
Mm-hmm.
So there is an important potential conflict. And we have to ask the questions, does giving space that has been fought for cis women, does that negatively impact them? Again, I think we have to look at that
Mm-hmm.
at a sort of case-by-case basis. And I don't see that there's been any evidence of harm to the cis women engaging in these sports. So again, one of the things that we've seen is that for most of these, for example, what was it? Just today, there was somebody in the White House press pool who was the Olympian who tied for 5th place with a trans athlete. I can't remember her name now, but and was very incensed, right? Felt like she should have, she wouldn't have tied with somebody. But we're talking about tied for 5th place, right? So there hasn't been a big demonstration that including trans individuals, and as you noted, there's very few of them, right, in sports, that this is having any negative impact on cis women or girls in sports.
Well, there's a claim. I do think there are some cis women who, as you just pointed out, claim they're being harmed, right? So I think there is a question of what would be evidence of harm.
I agree.
Yeah.
So yes, I know there are claims of harm. The way I would see those is we know about the harms that are inflicted due to exclusion, social exclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Those have been documented with many different groups, many different populations, many different areas of inclusion and exclusion, right? There's no question at all about the harms of exclusion.
Right.
The harms of inclusion so far, at least what I've seen, and maybe you've seen, more compelling arguments, but mostly I've seen maybe cis women could get hurt. Maybe cis women will get outcompeted. Or yes, I didn't win this, but how do we show that, right? How do we know you would have won, especially when we're talking about 5th place?
To your point, though, and I think this is why this has captured the political imagination, this really is a question of two minority populations. One is minoritized more, both claiming they could be harmed by it. So I think that might be one of the major, that's what makes this so naughty.
It is. And I'm sympathetic to that. I really am. So as a cis woman, as a feminist, as somebody who has fought for women's spaces, I am really sympathetic to this argument, but I think there has to be more demonstration of it actually harming cis women athletes before we can say, oh yeah, that's definitely, we just shouldn't allow these people to participate. Right. And again, I think it really has to be taken on a sport by sport basis. So there's a difference, say, between running track and wrestling, in part just because it's a physical sport. So this is one of the things, I think I put this in one of my notes to you, that we have to think about, so one of the arguments is cis women might express, we're more likely to get hurt.
Yeah.
This is definitely an argument that people have made.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I would say that you need to look at how do trans women, in terms of aggression, in terms of upper body strength, in terms of all those things, how do they compare to the other cis women athletes in that sport to decide whether or not it's a risk.
Right.
But then there are also these parts I think people aren't talking about as much. So going back to the wrestling example, is there an argument for cis women to say, I just don't want somebody, a male junk in my face?
Right.
Right.
Or I think this has also come up in lower courts or other discussions about changing rooms is another site. You've talked about the wide variety in typical males, typical females, and this does make me think of some cases where women in women's sports, because they have more male features, they might be targeted, and it makes me think of some of the slippery slopes of some of these lines of thinking.
Yeah. So, for example, and one of the cases that happened recently was in the boxing in the Olympics, right? And so there were accusations that some of the female participants were not actually female. And this gets back to, why it's so hard to use sex as the defining feature here. Because if we're saying we're going to have women boxers, because we assume women boxers have this range of traits, this level of strength, this level of upper body muscle mass, all of those kinds of things, we're not always going to be right? Even if we are choosing them based on some marker of sex, whether it's chromosomes or genitalia, there will be some women who have higher than average testosterone, who have greater than average upper body strength. And that has, do we exclude them, and if we don't exclude them, even though they are outside of the norm for cis women, then where's the argument for including trans women, even if they are outside of the norm for cis women? And so, I don't have the actual answers to any of those, because I think that really what needs to happen is we need people doing the homework. We need data. We need to look and see what are the distributions. Does it look like, so for example, let's say that for the sport, we wanted people that were female average height. Okay, do we exclude these women from participating in that sport? Right. Do we allow these men to participate in that sport?
Where are the lines? What are the borders?
So, already, it's like just basing it on sex is highly problematic. Adding in the idea of transitioning is even more problematic because there's so much we don't know about, for example, how timing of different hormonal treatments will affect the development of different features, how interruptible or reversible some of those effects are. So it seems to me that if our concern is, okay, we're running a boxing tournament and we want to be sure that people are relatively equitably matched, well, we already have a system for that.
Right.
In boxing, in wrestling, right? The weight classes. We have heavyweight champions. They don't fight the featherweights, right? So, and I'm not saying that weight itself would solve that problem.
Right.
Because again, men and women have different, on average, muscle mass. So matched for height, men will still have on average more muscle, or matched for weight, men will have more muscle. But there might be something that we can look at that's what is the relevant feature that makes these individuals together in a competitive class.
Yes.
And I don't think it's whether they produce egg or sperm.
It might not be this. It reminds me of another argument that somebody point out, I think it was Jon Stewart actually, who's like, look, if you're really, he's like, I have kids, they play sports. If you really are interested in equity, stop the red shirt. What is when parents hold their male child back a grade?
Oh, yeah.
So that they can play.
Yep, so they'll be bigger.
So that they'll be bigger.
Yep.
He's like, that's a real problem.
Oh,
if we're really
is.
interested in this, like, let's focus on that.
Well, and I mean, we can even go back to the idea that so many of women's sports only exist because they were trying to keep women out of men's sports, right? So a lot of sports should just be unisex anyway.
Yeah. I want to talk about another slippery slope. And again, this came up in the Supreme Court case. And it's going to take us away from sports and other potential attributes of men and women. And that is, what if we do a same sort of graph and we find that men are actually better at physics? Will we start, like, having stereotypes about women in physics? Like, so let's talk about non-physical characteristics that show up in some of your research and what we do with that.
So first of all, we need to think about, in the evolutionary sciences, we think about the trait that's under selection. Some traits are simpler than others. Mm-hmm. So height, there's a number of genes that go into that, and nutrition affects that, but it's a very easily measurable thing, right? The example that you just gave, competency in physics, first of all, is the result of a far more complex genetic underpinning that has to do with intelligence and comprehension and all sorts of things that all are variable, that all interact with the environment, and that then produce something that's really hard to measure, right? So physicists will argue amongst themselves about how to best measure competence in physics.
Right.
So that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that what we as evolutionists do when we see these patterns, our question is, why? So we see that sex difference in height. Now, that one, because it's not a social, there is a social component, because actually height is very strongly affected by nutrition. So there's a very strong social component, but the sex difference is not. Right. The sex difference is that shows up in every population, about the same size, So as an evolutionary scholar, I go, well, why? Why would men, on average, be taller than women? And we would think about that in terms of the adaptive challenges that would have faced males and females over evolutionary history, which largely has to do with competition over reproductive resources. So men are, on average, a little bit bigger, as are males in many species, because they fight over the very, very valuable reproductive resources that females have.
Right.
So physics, let's say we do a bell curve like that, and we see on our measure of competence in physics that men are scoring on average higher than women. So we'd ask the same question: why do we see that difference? The answer is going to be a lot harder to narrow down and to confirm.
Right.
Because first of all, our first question is going to be, did we measure competence in physics appropriately?
Right.
All right. So again, height, I know I measured height appropriately, but competence in physics, lots of people could argue, no, maybe if you measured it this way. And we saw that with, if we look at the history of things like IQ tests, right, which people used to think were objective. And then they realized they're incredibly culturally biased, right? This measure of physics competence might also be incredibly culturally biased. So that's the first question that we'd ask. Then if we're confident that, yes, there really seems to be a difference. So let's take something that's not competence, but actual positions. Okay. Women are very underrepresented in positions of leadership around the world. If you look at, heads of state, it's about, last I looked, I think fewer than 10% are women, right? And yet women are 50% of the population. So we ask, why are there so few women leaders? Some of it has to do with social institutions and cultural norms and social structures. Are women not sent to, or girls not sent to school? Do they have fewer opportunities? Are they less encouraged? All of those kinds of things. We also might look to evolutionary differences. And I will say that there are some evolutionary explanations for that have nothing to do with competence, because there's been no evidence anywhere that there's any significant sex difference, especially in general intelligence. There is evidence that there's some sex differences in specific kinds of cognition. So men, on average, tend to be a little bit better at spatial rotation. Women, on average, tend to be a little bit better at landmarks and finding locations. So there's some things like that tend to even out.
But to your point, like, it's just so hard to determine, is that biological, or are women assigned more tasks that help them?
It's really hard.
How do you do that as a researcher?
So here's how we do it. We devote our entire careers and lives to it, because the first thing you want to do is you want to look all around the world. And you want to say, well, is this sex difference the same in different places? Some things we'll find it's not. So let me think of a good one. Willingness to speak out in public, right? In some cultures, women speak out all the time. In some cultures, they don't at all. In other things, so for example, childcare. We see a huge amount of variation in the roles that men play. In some cultures, men are incredibly active, even in infant care. In some cultures, they're completely absent. What doesn't change much is women's role in that. Why doesn't women's role change much? Because of lactation, right? So that's a biological connection. It doesn't mean that all women are maternal. It doesn't mean that men aren't maternal, but it means that those two things, how we arrange our social lives and these biological features, are interacting with one another. How do we know if something is biological or cultural? Well, the first answer is that it's always both. It's always both. But the first thing is to look around the world, right? And to see what kinds of patterns we see. So, for example, sexual permissiveness is a really good example, right? So we have lots of studies that have looked at sexual motivation, how desirous of sexual encounters are men and women. And not surprisingly, we see massive cultural variation, right? So in some societies, everybody's like, no, you shouldn't have sex with anybody outside of marriage or whatever. And in some societies, people are like, you can have sex with whoever you want, it's fine. But we also see a really stable sex difference. So regardless of whether it's a society that's like, nobody should have sex with anybody else, or everybody can have sex with whoever they want, there's always a sex difference such that men are more motivated to pursue sexual opportunities. The whole thing might shift up if it's a more permissive society, or the whole thing might shift down if it's a less permissive society. What we don't see is any evidence of any culture in the world where women's sexuality is less restricted than men's. So we don't see that flip. And if we were expecting it to be like anything can happen, it's culturally arbitrary, then we should see some populations where women's sexuality is less restricted than men's, and we don't. So that's the first thing, is we look and see how stable are these patterns. If we get an indication that these patterns are really, really stable, then we start thinking about, okay, what might have been some of the adaptive challenges that might have led to some of these stable patterns? So going back to the women in leadership, right? There's a really stable pattern. Everywhere in the world, women are underrepresented in leadership roles. One hypothesis is that across the human evolutionary time, the potential payoffs to men, so engaging in politics is risky, right? You put yourself out there, you are the person who might be attacked by another community or whatever. There are all sorts of risks that come along with being politically engaged. On average, over evolutionary time, men would have been more likely to be able to reap exceptional benefits from that. So we can think about this in terms of, now it comes back to reproduction. A man who's highly successful, an ancestral man who's highly successful, right, might be able to have 4 or 5 wives that he impregnates.
Mm-hmm.
That means that he can increase his reproductive output 4 or 5 times.
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge, strongly favored by natural selection
Mm-hmm.
benefit,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because what is natural selection? It's just basically favoring those traits that leave more copies of themselves in the next generation, right? A female ancestral woman who wanted to engage in politics faces all the same risks, right? I might get in trouble, people might get mad at me, the neighboring communities might attack me, but she's not going to have the same kinds of benefits. Will she have benefits? Sure, because resources are important for female reproductive success as well, right? If I have more resources, my babies will be better taken care of. They're more likely to survive. I might be able to have 1 or 2 more, but I'm not going to quintuple my reproductive output. So it's a different cost benefit environment.
Right.
And so that's the hypothesis, that it's quite possible that, yes, there is a sex difference, that women are on average, less motivated to take on those risks for those potential benefits. But if my height was up there again, let's see, that's going to come up. But there are some women who are up here. Right? And those are our female leaders, right? The women who are engaging in that. So even if there is an on average sex difference, I still don't think that ever is a good criteria for using that, or a good reason for using sex as the criteria.
And I also want to add this, because sometimes when I get exercised over what I see as too deterministic, one of the things you say to me is, just because what seeing that also helps society do is to know how to help women become leaders.
Exactly.
Right. So we're not trying to necessarily freeze these things as normative, but it helps us understand how to change society.
Right. And so when it comes to female leadership, right, we'd say it's all of those things. There probably are some adaptive sex differences in motivation for pursuing those positions. There are definitely all sorts of social obstacles and discrimination. And yes, understanding those can help us dismantle them. If we assume that it's all because of these social roadblocks, we remove the roadblocks, we still go, well, wait, why are there still so few women, right? If we recognize that we need to get rid of those social roadblocks, and we need to think about the ways that women might be processing those costs and benefits differently, then we can actually change the structure to make it more profitable, as it were, for women. And by profitable, I don't mean in the money sense. But can I give you my Happy Meal analogy about why we shouldn't use sex? So that question of, if we do this and we find that in physics competence, does that mean that we should then focus on hiring male physicists? No. And here's where I'll use my Happy Meal analogy. So for those of us who have small children who have gotten Happy Meals at McDonald's, or who just like them yourselves, we know that usually McDonald's has 2 different toys. They have 2 different toys because they do market research, and they find that on average, boys like some toys better than girls do, and girls like other toys better than boys do. It only becomes problematic because if you go up to McDonald's and you say, I'd like 2 Happy Meals, or I'd like a Happy Meal, they say, is it for a boy or a girl? Okay, I have a boy and a girl, and we might get to that later too, but they inevitably wanted the different toys, right? If they would just ask, do you want this toy or that toy? Every kid would get the toy they want. Guess what? There would still be a sex difference. Boys would be more likely to choose one toy. Girls would be more likely to choose another toy. But these kids, at the ends, right, don't need to explain to anybody why, yes, I'm a boy, but I want that toy, or yes, I'm a girl, but it's
Right.
so it's like that.
And it's so harmless.
Why are
it's
we
so
using
easy
sex
to
as the criteria when it's even when we see these patterns, that doesn't mean that knowing somebody's sex is the best way of knowing how tall they are.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like,
yes. Perfect analogy. We like to think about what is the interplay between our scholarship and our private lives, right? You have 2 trans children. How has that changed the questions you ask of research, like what you notice? How does it impact your scholarship?
So, well, first I will put out there that my children are 16 and 13, so I'm not questioning their trans identity any more than I question identity in general.
Yeah.
Identity is ever changing. When I was 16, I thought I was a vegetarian anarchist actor, and I'm not. But yes, I have 2 children who identify as trans. They like to joke that, I had a boy and a girl, and then they both swapped, so I still have a boy and a girl. How has it affected my scholarship? I think probably mostly in terms of thinking in 2 parallel trajectories. So I've always been interested in basically what defines maleness and femaleness, again, socially and biologically. But having kids going through this has made me thinking a lot more about development, and also a lot more about how our children's transitions affect us as parents, which is really interesting because I actually several years ago, I had a good friend of mine that I'd been friends with since high school who came out as trans and asked me to moderate with her parents because her parents really were struggling, understanding and all these things. And even then, I didn't really have quite the sense I do now of how challenging it can be, not because it's trans or cis or whatever else, but because when your child says to you that the first 10 years of my life were a lie, that's pretty gut-wrenching. So it's made me think a lot about that, and a lot about how we process other people's sex and gender, right? Because one of the things I alluded to before is that, and we have lots of evidence to this effect, that humans really, 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 really want to categorize people by sex and gender. And there's lots of good reasons why, on average, we would have done that over evolutionary history that are less useful now. But it does mean that we struggle with those. And I think that it's important to think about the people who are allies, who are 100% supporters, but who might still have either things like, but wait, can I refer to you as my son when I'm talking about you when you were an infant? Or even things like, I lost that one. Never mind.
You cut that part, it's giving you a sort of humility, I think, about how this is discussed, processed. And
and really, but also I think in thinking about how identity is constructed, because as I said, we see identity constructed in our children. And we know it's a changing thing. It's really interesting to be in a world now where one of those changing things is their sex identity. So here's something else I will say, and this is not as a scholar, this is just as a layperson, observer, that when I was in school, I'd never heard of transsexual people. When I started teaching here, which wasn't that long ago, about 15 years ago, when I teach the anthropology of sex and gender class, a large chunk of it was describing and explaining trans identity and the various flavors of trans identity and basically sex identity variation. Because students at that time, 15 years ago, college students, a lot of them like really weren't aware that such a thing existed.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're at a place where everybody recognizes that this is a thing that
Mm-hmm.
exists out there in the world. And I can tell you that in my kids' classes, there is an extraordinary proportion of kids who identify as non-binary, intersex, trans.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see where this goes, right?
Right.
But one of the things that we didn't actually get to, which I said was important, is the fact that I said sex hasn't changed. Human sex hasn't changed. And what that means is that we also should assume that the sex distributions,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of people who fit quite nicely into their, sex specific patterns, those who don't fit neatly into that, those who feel that they are not the same sex, those who are attracted to same sex individuals,
Mm-hmm.
or, all of those flavors of human sex and gender diversity have always existed.
Yeah.
There have always been trans people, there have always been gay people,
Mm-hmm.
there have always been aroace people, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of those people have always existed.
Yeah.
And probably in pretty similar proportions to how they exist now.
Yeah.
And for that, we'll have to go through a whole population genetics thing, which we won't.
Next time.
But we can pretty confidently say that that's almost certainly true.
Yeah.
So when we see that 30% of a class is identifying as trans or non-binary,
Mm-hmm.
we might be a little skeptical that all 30% of those are going to, at the end of their lives, be like, yes, I actually want to transition.
Right.
But how wonderful is it
that
we live in a time where kids can explore that, where they're not, stuck in one identity.
Yeah. Yeah. It is just, as always, been such a pleasure to talk to you. For our audience members who would love to learn more from you, from your colleagues who look at similar topics, where can they find you? What do you teach? Can you tell us a little bit about the center you run?
So I mentioned one of my classes, which is the Anthropology of Sex and Gender,
Mm-hmm.
which is all about this. So if you're
Mm-hmm.
interested in this is what we spend the whole semester talking about. Though I will say that there are similar flavored classes throughout the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, in philosophy, in psychology, in obviously gender studies.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually would very much encourage students to take those classes in multiple different departments, because you'll get slightly different perspectives on the question. Then the center, so I am also the director of the Center for the Study of Human Nature, which is broadly evolutionary social scientists. So most of us are in anthropology or psychology, and we are interested in exactly what I said before. What is it that makes humans human?
Mm-hmm.
We believe very strongly that yes, there are things that make humans human, and not chimpanzees or dolphins, or whatever. But trying to figure out what some of those things are, and some of that has to do with things like sex differences. Anyway, the Center for Study of Human Nature meets every Friday, and it's open to everybody.
Where do you meet?
We meet in McCarthy Hall 428 at 3 p.m. It's mostly a working group, which means that it's largely attended by faculty and grad students and some advanced undergraduate students who are really working on research in these areas. But we also frequently have visiting scholars come and give talks. And those are always open to the public. All our meetings are open to the public, but you might be more interested if there's like an actual speaker coming. And so we had somebody from UCLA who was talking about the evolution of friendship and how important that is.
I was sad to miss that.
Right? So we have some really fantastic speakers come in. Sometimes we will present our own work. We also host our grad students, both in psychology and in anthropology. Those who are part of the center will do their master's defenses. Yeah. So it's a great group to be a part of. People can email me if they want to join or if they want more information.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Until next time.
Yes, thank you.